Every revolution starts in the minds of the people. Arm yourself for the war of ideas. Take back your life. Take back your liberty. Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Today is Saturday, February 28th, and I'm coming to you unexpectedly because, unfortunately, we've got some bad news this morning that President Trump has indeed gone ahead with a joint military action along with Israel in attacking Iran. Now, as far as I know, so far, this is not an invasion. It's just an extensive bombing campaign. Unfortunately, it has a name. That's never a good sign. It's Operation Epic Fury, the usual cartoonish, childish nonsense that we get from present administrations, not just Trump's. And I mean, for what it's worth, Trump has again violated the War Powers Resolution Act of 1973 and his oath to the Constitution. He's by no means alone. I mean, it's a rare case where a president doesn't violate both of those things, at least one of them, at least in the post-war period in my lifetime. Just about all of them have, if they all haven't, at one point or another. I know George W. Bush went to Congress for permission to go into Iraq and Afghanistan. So although those wars were unnecessary and harmful and wasteful, at least he somewhat followed the Constitution. I'll get into why I'm saying somewhat in a moment. But there was no justification for Trump to attack Iran this morning, nor for him to have attacked it last June, or Syria for that matter. I think in his first term, same with Biden attacking Syria. I mean, all these presidents just consider it their privilege to initiate military action, and especially if they don't use actual boots on the ground, they almost consider it like it's not war, but it is. It is an act of war to bomb another country. Is this something controversial I'm saying? Because I do see comments on social media. It's not a war, they're just bombing. I mean, that's how desensitized the average American has become because of our situation here. You know, there is no war, and the United States hasn't experienced a war since, I guess, the Civil War, where it's actually on your own soil and your own cities are being bombed and houses burned and civilians killed. America has been insulated from that for so long that I'm afraid that they've become desensitized to when the United States government perpetrates 9/11 on, another country every other week. So I wanted to address specifically the War Powers Resolution part of this and the declaration of war power, because I think there's a lot of confusion out there. And I've already seen people, even honestly, in good faith, bring up my comments that this violates the act by saying, oh no, the president has 60 days. And that's not what the War Powers Resolution says. So the War Powers Resolution was passed by a Democratic Congress, of course, when a Republican president was in office, because that's when the Democrats care about war. And, it was passed to rein in Nixon, after Johnson had waged the Vietnam War for all those years. And then Nixon got in there. And, strictly speaking, again, the president got the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, but it only authorized war against Vietnam. So when Nixon started bombing Cambodia and Laos and other places or sending troops there, that's when Congress said, no, you can't do that. And this was, by the time they did this, 1973, the war was already very unpopular, had been going on for a decade. And, Congress, of course, they're never just doing the right thing. They're doing what they think will keep them in office. So I'm going to just read you And I've got an article on my Substack about this as well. So go and read it if you get a chance. I mean, all of you that are listening to the podcast, definitely subscribe to the Substack. I'm supposed to tell you to subscribe to the podcast too. This is the first time I've ever remembered before, right before I got off. But yeah, subscribe to this podcast, share it, like it, and please comment on it. I never get any comments. I get emails and messages, IMs on Facebook, even messages on X, which, it's not even made for messaging. So don't do that. Leave a comment so everyone can benefit from your brilliance. And of course, all the people listening to my podcast are brilliant. So getting back to the War Powers Resolution, here's what it says before it gets into any of the language about the president reporting to Congress and having 60 days to do anything, before he has to get congressional approval. It says, and, this is right at the beginning, the constitutional powers of the president as commander-in-chief to introduce United States Armed Forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances are exercised only pursuant to 1, a declaration of war, 2, specific statutory authorization, or 3, a national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. So the president can't bomb anybody if one of those 3 things doesn't apply. Okay? So the first 2 have to have a vote by Congress. That's specific statutory authorization is a vote by Congress and then signed by the president. And a declaration of war is also a vote by Congress. Okay? So the third one, a national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. That means that the president doesn't have to wait for Congress if bombs are falling on New York, okay, or on Guam, a United States territory, or on a United States military base, I don't know, stationed overseas, or here, obviously, in the United States. Now, of course, there shouldn't be any U.S. military bases overseas, but the fact that there are, the Congress does, or the War Powers Resolution does authorize the president to respond to an attack on them there. And that kind of goes without saying. If a military base in Iraq were attacked, a U.S. military base, I think we're out of there, or Syria, wherever. Again, we shouldn't be there, but if it were attacked, I mean, the military is going to respond anyway. I don't even know that they're going to ask the president first if someone's actually shooting at them, they're going to shoot back. So this is just common sense. But short of that, president's not supposed to be bombing anybody, not supposed to be kidnapping presidents in Venezuela, not supposed to be doing any of this stuff, bombing Syria. They use chemical weapons on their own people. President's not allowed to respond to that with the military. Trump did it. Biden did it. Obama did it. Okay. Obama did it even after Congress told him he couldn't do it. He still went ahead and sent troops into Syria. So he should have been impeached for that. Biden should have been impeached. Trump should have been impeached his first term for bombing Syria. Okay. All right. So here we have another example of a president using the military, not defensively, not in response to an attack, which the law requires unless Congress declares war. And, nobody cares, really. The Democrats don't care. I'm sure a few will, like Thomas Massey and the guy he's doing the Epstein thing with, Roe, whatever, they'll care. Ron Paul used to care, and he used to get some Democrats to care. But the vast majority won't. In the Roman spectacle the other night, like I mentioned, the Democrats, we got a Republican in the White House, so they don't clap for the Republican president, and the Republicans won't clap for the Democratic, but they all clapped when he started saber rattling against Iran. Okay. So they're not going to do anything about this. They're not going to impeach him. If they impeach him when he gets back in office, it'll be for some stupid thing and not for this, which is clearly an impeachable offense. He's breaking what is arguably the most important law that Congress has ever passed, and that is to define under what circumstances can a president initiate military action. And that, I just told you the three, and none of them were present this morning. So he broke the law. And I mean, it goes further. There's more to say here about this, but the tall and short of it is that if you break the most important law that Congress has ever passed, then you should be impeached. Now, impeachment, it's not legally required, because impeachment is always and everywhere a political act and option. Okay. But since they've used it for lying about an affair in the White House and about this bogus insurrection that the moron brigade was supposedly involved in at Trump's behest on January 6th, 2021. Well, how anyone but Joe Biden was going to be inaugurated later that month based on anything these yahoos were doing in the Capitol. And no one's ever explained to me, but they impeached him for that. They impeached him for trying to massage Zelensky before sending military aid, unconstitutional military aid, over to Ukraine, with whom we have no treaty. And the Constitution does not authorize sending taxpayer money to. Okay, that they impeached him for that. But for this, no, nothing. Clinton bombing Serbia, no. I mean, so it's kind of a joke. Impeachment truly is a purely political matter that will never be used for the benefit of the American people. It never has been. It never will be. And, I wanted to say, in addition to this, that we're so far from the Constitution and what it was supposed to, what the kind of government that it was supposed to constitute, create. You have to remember that the United States was a libertarian country. Libertarianism was the dominant political philosophy in the United States during the 19th century, less and less as the century waned on. But before the Civil War, it was dominant. And the Constitution, although a great expansion of federal power over the Articles of Confederation, still was set up on libertarian principles to make the government a very libertarian, enforcing the non-aggression principle government. The whole Bill of Rights is there. All those amendments are there to ensure that the government never aggresses. It can never suppress your speech, because speech is not a violation of anyone's property rights, nor is practicing a religion. Government's not allowed to pass any laws about that. Just merely possessing weapons is not a violation of anyone else's property rights. Therefore, the government's not allowed to regulate that. And by the way, the First Amendment does not give the government the power to regulate the right to keep and bear arms. It says the reason that this amendment's being passed is because a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state. That just says why we have the Second Amendment. It doesn't grant any power to regulate or any power otherwise. All it does is prohibit power. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's all it should say. Madison was the worst person in the world to write the Bill of Rights because he was a big government guy, although one with a lot of integrity who realized his big government plan didn't get passed, and therefore the Constitution should be respected. But first of all, he was just very verbose. And on every issue, he's just says way too much and confuses things. But in any case, the Second Amendment does not grant any power at all to the federal government, period, to regulate arms possession or otherwise. It merely prohibits. And all the First Amendment, all of the Bill of Rights amendments are the same. Why is the Fourth Amendment there? It's like, well, if we're going to investigate a crime, we're going to have to search some people. Well, then you can't do it without at least probable cause. We can't have a trial over the search. You'll won't have the evidence for the trial. See what I mean? So the Constitution is very libertarian. All these checks and balances are there to restrain the government. Okay? And the declaration of war power is no different. So a lot of people think the declaration of war power gives Congress the right to start a war or even issue an authorization of military force. And granted, it's, that latter power has been exercised as far back as Jefferson. But that's not really what a declaration of war is. A declaration of war is just that. It's a declaration. It's recognizing that something already exists. It's not the power to create a war. It's the power to say, hey, because this other country did this to us or is obviously imminently about to do this thing to us, a state of war exists already, and we're just declaring it. That's what the power is. And, for anyone who thinks, oh, well, that's just, a theory or a stretch, a bridge too far, just go back and read them. I'll post, in addition to my article, it links back to one I wrote many years ago that has more examples. But if you go back and read any of the declarations of war by Congress and the president's request, they all are consistent with what I just said. The other country has done thus and so, whatever it was. Because they did that, a state of war now exists. And then Congress actually directs the president to end the war, not to start a war. Okay? So I'll just give you the Mexican-American War, which, by the way, that doesn't mean that these wars were justified. Like, I think that the U.S. did what it often does, which is instigates the other country into firing the first shot. Even Lincoln did with the Confederates and said he was going to do it. Then he did it. But in any case, at least they recognize, like, we can't use our military unless, some country has committed an act of war against us. So here I'm going to read to you what President Polk said to Congress when he asked for the declaration of war. He said, "But now, after reiterated menaces, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory and shed American blood upon American soil. She has proclaimed that hostilities have commenced and that the two nations are now at war, As war exists," okay, saying it already exists. As war exists, and notwithstanding all our efforts to avoid it, exists by the act of Mexico herself, we are called upon by every consideration of duty and patriotism to vindicate with decision the honor, the rights, and the interests of our country. In further vindication of our rights and defense of our territory, I invoke the prompt action of Congress to recognize the existence of the war, and to place at the disposition of the executive the means of prosecuting the war with vigor and thus hastening the restoration of peace. That was Polk talking about something that had happened just within a few weeks before. And he's still asking Congress for permission to use the military to, in his own words, end a war that Mexico already created. Okay? Important to understand that that's what the power means. Now, here's what Congress actually passed by vote. Whereas by the act of the Republic of Mexico, a state of war exists between that government and the United States. Okay. So just like I said, it's recognizing that there's already a war. We're just declaring it. We're not creating it. We're not starting it. We're declaring that a war already exists because of what Mexico did. Whereas by the act of the Republic of Mexico, a state of war exists between that government and the United States, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that for the purpose of enabling the government of the United States to prosecute said war to a speedy and successful termination. And then it goes on, giving the president. So, and go again, I invite you to go, if you really want to check me on my proof, you go to my Substack article, and maybe I'll just post this other one from years ago and make it easier for you. Another article I wrote called "What's So Important About a Declaration of War?" When was this? I know it was in the Ron Paul days, at least. I can't find the date because it's at the bottom. Oh, these are all notes, so it might be before these. Well, in any case, it was a long time ago, a decade or more ago. Why must we declare war? That's 2008. So I think this one is from somewhere back there. But in any case, those, I believe, quote all the declarations, and you're welcome to go research them. They're all going to say the same thing. I mean, most people remember the awful FDR's declaration of war against Japan. Since this dastardly attack, I asked Congress to declare that a state of war has existed between the United States and the Empire of Japan, right? So they all say this, they all follow that format. They did this. It was an act of war. Therefore, the state of war exists. Okay. So, I mean, even one could argue the declaration of war power is limited, and that's when a vote of Congress. But even if you don't want to go with me that far, there's no argument for the president initiating a war for anything that other than an attack that's going on right now. Shells and bullets are flying right now. The president can use the military to repel that. You can't wait for a vote while they're shooting at you. And he's supposed to take his first opportunity, even under those circumstances, to consult with Congress and get some kind of direction from Congress. And at the very most, he's allowed to use the military for 60 days. After that, even if we're under attack, he's not supposed to be doing anything. So this is very limiting. The president, now, Trump made a statement. Why are you doing this? And his statement goes on to cite like the hostages from 1979, the Hezbollah bombing in Lebanon from the 1980s during the Reagan years that Iran is alleged to have funded. And, of course, they probably are funding Hezbollah. Whether they funded that attack or whether it matters is another question. The attack on the USS Cole 25 years ago. So, and then he keeps going up to the present day. And the last one he mentions is the attack on Israel, which should be irrelevant to the U.S. president using the United States military without Congress. Okay. So we don't have a treaty with Israel either. And even if we did, he'd have to go to Congress for something that happened in the past. All he can do is respond to bullets flying right now. Okay, that's clear. That's what the War Powers Resolution Act was passed to do. Now, even before the act, this was the understanding. Okay, the Constitution delegates the war power to Congress. So before they passed the act, presidents were not supposed to use the military unless they were repelling an attack in the present. And the founders spoke about this. The Constitution, it has holes, or it has at least room for dishonest wiggling, I would really call it. I don't think it's really got holes. But someone might say, well, I mean, what if the British sail into New York Harbor, which was certainly a possibility in 1789, and start bombing, shelling New York? We can't wait for a vote on this. We gotta defend ourselves. And then many of the founders said, yeah, under an attack, then the president can take that action. But short of that, he's got to ask Congress. They were very adamant about this. So, there's no justification for this. But I'll tell you, the president is more likely to be impeached for uttering what's claimed to be like a racial epithet, or saying something about trans people, than he is for this. That's how childish, that's how clueless, delusional the American public has become, that, it's just normal for presidents to bomb other countries in violation of the law and the Constitution. So, I mean, a lot of people are going to say, where were you when Obama? Well, I was right here doing the same thing when Obama did it, when Biden did it, when Clinton did it, when Bush did it. Yeah. So believe me, you're not going to get me on that one for anybody silly enough to try. And it really doesn't matter. It's like a crime committed in the past doesn't give license to a crime committed in the future. And it really speaks to another thing, and I think I've said this even on the immigration kerfluffle. All we hear about is democracy in danger. And by the way, none of the U.S. governments are democracies. The federal government is not a democracy. None of the state governments are democracies. They're all republics. And they have democratic elements. Now, the state governments are more democratic. I would say way too democratic, as we found out during COVID and many times before, because the state governments basically say you can elect representatives and they can pass any laws they want unless they violate the Bill of Rights. The federal government says, Constitution says, that you can elect a Congress, but they can only pass the laws exercising these enumerated powers, which are very few. Now, of course, they ignore that completely. And then they go to the Supreme Court to get rubber stamps saying, well, that's interstate commerce, right? Like if you eliminated the Commerce Clause, like 90% of the government would go away. But in any case, like the Bill of Rights, it was argued early on, was not even necessary for the federal government because they were limited to these enumerated powers. So, of course, they could never, pass a law that restricted speech. That's not one of the enumerated powers, I'm sure. And actually, logically, that does make sense. Argument made by the Federalists trying to prevent a Bill of Rights. I'm certainly glad they passed it because, and for all intents and purposes, the government operates under the understanding as if it were like the state constitutions, that the only thing they can't do is something prohibited. And then they even do, a lot of that. And again, get it rubber stamped by the Supreme Court. But so in any case, we have a republic that's supposed to be limited, but it has some democratic elements to it. And the democratic part is you get to elect the people who make the laws. That's it. That's the only democracy. The rest of it is all not democracy. But nobody cares about that. I mean, really, they say, oh my God, our democracy. By the way, free speech has nothing to do with democracy. The First Amendment's there to protect us against democracy, against the democratically elected Congress I just mentioned, infringing our speech with a law they passed. The whole Bill of Rights is anti-democratic. The Second Amendment is there to protect us from democracy because the mob may want to take away our guns. They've certainly been trying. Okay. The democratic part is you get to elect the legislators, the people who make the laws. You don't get to vote on the laws. So that part's not democratic, just the people who make them. But nobody cares when the president, who's not directly elected by the people, by the way, violates the laws that the elected people made. No one cares. No one cares when he violates this most important law about the limits on military action for a president. The whole big kerfluffle about the immigration laws is not, let's go blow whistles at the legislators who passed them or refuse to change them. Let's go harass the people who enforce them. Well, I guess you don't want a democracy then, because they passed these laws and, you don't want them enforced. And it goes on and on. I mean, these are just a few current examples, but nobody really cares about democracy or, even the system we have, the Republican system with some democratic elements. They just want the government to exercise the power they happen to want at the moment. That's what they want. They're like a child stamping their feet and demanding, 6,000 grams of sugar. And when they don't get it, they cry. That's what we've been reduced to, it seems like. And I'm not exactly sure what the way out of this is. There was this whole we've gone through 10 years of the whole Trump thing. And of course, Trump was always, I never had a lot of hope for Trump. I thought maybe a few good things would be done, but he never even ran on any real principles. His principles are those of Alexander Hamilton and Teddy Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln. Not the slavery part, but the rest. Okay, Trump thinks Teddy Roosevelt was a great president, and so do most of his supporters. So any good that was going to come out of him was limited, but really, at this point, what would have been different if they just elected Jeb Bush? What would have been different? Maybe immigration, maybe. And that's like a dubious, at least for libertarians, you're on thin ice with the immigration laws. I mean, certainly unconstitutional at the federal level because those are state powers. That's what Madison said. All right. And then even, is there a libertarian basis for excluding people from land you don't own? I'm going to write something on this because there is an argument that actually we do own the land, whether we like it or not. But then the question becomes, well, what do you care if somebody goes on land you're never going to go to or, whatever. So the whole immigration thing is a mixed bag. Trump's been, marginally better on that. It's not really deporting that many people. And the ones he is deporting, he seems to be doing in the clumsiest, most egregious way. At least he was in Minnesota. Then he's backed down from that. So, I mean, again, what is all this no kings, democracy in danger? We have presidents frequently flouting the important laws, getting away with it with bipartisan support, and nobody really cares. And I think that's the worst thing about it. What I fear is that there will be some day where Americans will no longer be insulated from the consequences of these unprovoked, aggressive wars, and the bombs will drop here someday. I hope that never happens. And plenty of people will comment, "Oh, you're a doomicon," or whatever the latest moronic slogan is. But someday we may have to pay a price for all of this. Even those of us who protested every single instance of an unconstitutional and illegal war, and that's the real tragedy of it. So we'll leave it there. I have coming up this week, forgot to mention yesterday, Colonel Douglas McGregor will be back with me. I believe I'm recording something with him on Wednesday, and then we'll have that available for you Wednesday evening or Thursday. And I want to get into the whole, military aspects of Iran because, he has said for many, many years, this is not going to be a cakewalk. And to some extent, I don't understand that because Iran is a destitute country. Their whole GDP is like 384 billion. Okay, it's about a third of the U.S. military budget. Their military budget is 23 billion. The U.S. military budget is 1,000 billion, a trillion. So I don't get how they're a threat. I know the land mass of Iran is big, but I don't get it. But then again, I have to, temper that with the idea that Russia, their military budget was under 100 billion for most of the last decade. Once they started this war, they're up to 160 billion now. Okay, so again, a fraction of the U.S. military budget. So how can they defeat Ukraine, which is no cakewalk? Never has been for 1,000 years, completely backed by the U.S. and NATO on 160 billion a year. But the United States can't defeat Afghanistan in 20 years, spending $1 trillion a year. So somehow or other, they're getting a lot more for their buck out of their military. And I want to get into that with Colonel McGregor and also just his thoughts and his expertise and knowledge of what a wider war with Iran might look like. I mean, they can just bomb them as they have before, but I don't think you're going to get a regime change without going in there, right? And if they do that, I think it's going to be horrific. And let's hope that doesn't happen. Let's hope they stop bombing them because contrary to popular belief, bombing another country is an act of war. A state of war now exists between the United States and Iran. The fact that Iran hasn't declared it, nor has the United States, doesn't change the fact. One little skirmish was enough for a state of war to exist between the United States and Mexico. Certainly bombing them multiple times has created a state of war. And let's hope we can get out of it and back to a state of peace between the two countries as soon as possible. So I want to thank everybody for listening again. Make sure you stay tuned for that interview coming up with Douglas McGregor, Colonel Douglas McGregor, and I'll see you all next time on Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
The war of ideas has only just begun. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need by heading to TomMullenTalksFreedom.com and subscribing to our email list. And remember, every revolution starts in the minds of the people.